There is a city of 14 million people where ancient magic is still being practiced. Not as a tourist attraction. Not as a cultural performance for visitors with cameras. As actual governance. As an actual, functioning system of spiritual protection that the city's planners take seriously, that the government maintains, and that has been operating continuously for over 400 years. That city is Tokyo. And the country is Japan. I want you to think about what it means for a modern nation, a technologically advanced, economically powerful, internationally integrated modern nation, to still be using magic. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically, in the way that all governments use symbols. But in the literal sense, designing cities around spiritual barriers, maintaining shrines at specific geographic coordinates to contain vengeful spirits, funding rituals to appease the dead. Japan does all of this. And tonight I want to tell you why. And how. And what happens when someone tries to interfere with the magic. Because that part of the story, what happens when someone challenges the magic, is the part that I think will stay with you longest. Let's start with a question that might seem simple but isn't. Why does Japan have so many shrines? If you've been to Japan or seen photographs of Japan, you've noticed them. They're everywhere. In city centers, at the end of shopping streets, tucked into corners between apartment buildings, at the base of mountains, at crossroads, in forests, at the edges of rivers. Japan has more than 80,000 Shinto shrines. 80,000. In a country roughly the size of California. The Western explanation for this is usually, Japan is a religious country. Shinto is an animist religion that sees spirits in everything, in mountains, in rivers, in trees, and the shrines are built wherever a spirit is felt to reside. That explanation is correct. But it's incomplete. The fuller answer involves something that sounds, to Western ears, like superstition, but that Japanese governance, for 400 years, has treated as engineering. When Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Edo shogunate in the early 17th century and chose the small castle town of Edo, future Tokyo, as his capital, he didn't just build administrative buildings and a castle. He built a spiritual system. He placed shrines at specific coordinates around the city. He oriented buildings along specific axes. He created a network of sacred sites that, taken together, formed something that Japanese tradition calls a kekkai. A barrier. A magical barrier, built not from walls or weapons, but from the accumulated spiritual power of thousands of years of Shinto practice, concentrated at carefully chosen points across the landscape. The purpose, to protect Edo from the forces that Japanese tradition knew could destroy a city from within. Not enemy armies. Not economic collapse. Not plague. The forces Japan's rulers were most afraid of were something far older and stranger than any of those. They were afraid of the dead. Specifically, they were afraid of the vengeful dead. The onryo, spirits of people who died with unresolved grievances, with rage and sorrow so powerful that it didn't dissipate when the body stopped. Spirits that, if not contained and appeased, could curse the living, bring disaster to entire cities, and destabilize governments. And Japan, in its long history, had produced 3 of these spirits so powerful that they have their own collective name. The 3 great vengeful spirits of Japan. Nihon Sandai Onryo. I'm going to tell you about all 3 of them tonight. And I want you to understand, as I tell these stories, that I am not telling you folklore. I am telling you history, events that are documented, that happen to real people, in real places, at specific dates. And I am also telling you about the consequences of those events, as they were experienced and recorded by the people who came after. Because in Japan, the line between historical fact and supernatural consequence has always been drawn differently than in the West. The spirits are real. That is not a belief that Japan holds politely while secretly thinking otherwise. It is a belief that has shaped the physical layout of the country's largest city. that has preserved a small stone mound in the middle of one of the most expensive real estate districts on Earth, surrounded by the headquarters of major banks and corporations, because removing it has proven, more than once, to be a very bad idea. We'll get to that mound. But first, the three spirits. Because you need to understand who they were, and what was done to them, to understand why the magic was necessary. And why it still is. Let me give you a more concrete sense of what I mean when I say Japan uses magic to govern itself. In 2011, when the Great East Japan earthquake struck, the one that triggered the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the Japanese government's immediate response included, alongside the mobilization of the self-defense forces and the coordination of international aid, the performance of ritual prayers at specific shrines along the affected coastline. This was not a gesture. It was not a photo opportunity. The rituals were performed by Shinto priests in full ceremonial dress, at sites that have been maintained for this specific purpose, for exactly this kind of moment, when the forces that Japanese tradition recognizes as dangerous have broken through. The shrines along the Tohoku coast, many of them extremely old, had specific functions in the spiritual geography of the region. They were placed where they were for reasons that the communities understood over centuries of experience with what the sea and the land could do. And when the tsunami came, something remarkable was noted afterward. Many of the shrines, places that had been carefully maintained on elevated ground, at specific distances from the water, for reasons that their original builders would have described in spiritual terms, were still standing. The lower ground around them was destroyed. Coincidence? Perhaps. The placement of shrines on elevated ground for practical reasons, for visibility, for safety, for the simple fact that dry high ground is better building land, could explain all of it without recourse to anything supernatural. But there is another way to read it. That the people who placed those shrines understood something about the land and the sea that accumulated over generations of observation. That what they called spiritual geography was actually a very sophisticated form of environmental knowledge, encoded in ritual and maintained through religious practice because that was the technology available to them. In that reading, the shrines are not evidence of magic. They are evidence of memory. Of the long, careful memory of a culture that took seriously the question of where disaster comes from. And that memory, encoded in 80,000 shrines across the country, may have saved lives. That is Japan's magic, at its deepest level. Not supernatural power. Accumulated wisdom, maintained through ritual, across more generations than any other knowledge-keeping system has managed to sustain in the modern world. I want to be specific about what makes Japan unique in this regard. Every culture has religious traditions. Every culture has ancient beliefs about sacred places and spiritual forces. What distinguishes Japan is not the existence of these beliefs, it is their integration with modern governance and modern economics. The fact that they were never displaced. Never relegated to the purely private sphere, to Sunday mornings and personal devotion. They remained, in Japan, part of the public infrastructure. This happened for a specific historical reason. Japan's modernization in the Meiji period, the rapid, deliberate adoption of Western technology and institutions in the 19th century, was structured around the emperor. The emperor was the axis of Japanese identity, and the emperor's authority was explicitly spiritual. Shinto, the religion of the emperor, of the shrines, of the spirits, was constitutionally integrated into the Japanese state. After the Second World War, this integration was formally dissolved. Shinto was separated from the state. The emperor became a symbolic figure rather than a divine one. But the shrines didn't move. The ceremonies didn't stop. The corporations in Otomachi kept sending people to maintain the Kubizuka. Because the formal relationship between state and spirit had changed, but the practical relationship between city and history had not. Tokyo is still built on the foundation that Tokugawa Ieyasu laid. The map of the shrines is still the map of the spiritual infrastructure. And the Japanese people, without any formal requirement, without any government mandate, chose to maintain it. That choice, sustained across generations without enforcement, is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. The first of Japan's three great vengeful spirits was not a warrior. He was a scholar. His name was Sugawara no Mikizane, and in the 9th century he was one of the most respected men in Japan. A poet, a calligrapher, a government official of genuine ability. He rose through the court of Emperor Uda to become one of the most powerful ministers in the country, a remarkable achievement for a man whose family, while noble, was not from the highest aristocratic ranks. He was, by all accounts, a good man. Honest. Learned. Devoted to his work and to the emperor who trusted him. And then everything collapsed. The Fujiwara clan, the most powerful aristocratic family in Japan, the family that had controlled the court for generations through strategic marriages and political maneuvering, saw Mikizane as a threat. He was too capable, too trusted, too close to the emperor. And so they worked to destroy him. They fabricated accusations. They whispered to the new emperor, Emperor Daigo, that Mikizane was plotting treason, that this loyal, scholarly minister was secretly scheming to put his own grandson on the throne. The accusations were lies. But they worked. In 901, Sugawara no Mikizane was stripped of his position. He was sent into exile in Dazaifu, in the far south of Japan, a posting so remote and so beneath his station that it was understood by everyone as a form of death sentence. Not immediate death. A slow death. Far from the capital, far from everything that had given his life meaning. He died 2 years later, in 903. Heartbroken. In poverty. In exile. Writing poetry about plum trees and longing. And then the punishment began. Not punishment of Mikizane. Punishment of everyone who had wronged him. In 908, Fujiwara no Shugane, one of the officials who had participated in the conspiracy against Mikizane, was struck by lightning and died. The next year, the chief conspirator, Fujiwara no Tokihira, fell mysteriously ill and died at the age of 39. The imperial palace in Kyoto was struck by lightning. Multiple times. The crown prince died. Then another prince died. Then another member of the Fujiwara clan. Emperor Daigo himself fell gravely ill. Kyoto was struck by floods. Then drought. Then plague. The disasters came one after another, and the connection that everyone drew, the connection that the terrified survivors drew, because they had seen these things with their own eyes, was the spirit of Sugawara no Mikizane. The man who had died wrongfully, far from home, his poetry ignored and his loyalty repaid with exile. His rage had not died with his body. It had grown. The court's response was extraordinary. They posthumously restored Mikizane's rank. They promoted him, a dead man, to his original position in the government. They built a shrine to him in Kyoto, the Kiteno Tenmangu, and enshrined him as a deity, Tenjin, the heavenly god. The god of learning, of scholarship, of poetry. Today, Kiteno Tenmangu is one of the most visited shrines in Japan. Students pray there before examinations. Families bring their children to ask for academic success. Mikizane, the exiled scholar who died in poverty, is now worshipped across 12,000 Tenjin shrines throughout Japan. The conversion from wronged man to appeased god took extraordinary effort. But it worked. The disasters stopped. The second great vengeful spirit was everything Mikizane was not. His name was Taira no Masakado, and he was a warrior. In the 10th century, Masakado was a member of the powerful Taira clan, a samurai family with ties to the imperial line. He was based in the Kanto region, the area where Tokyo now stands, and he was by reputation a formidable fighter and a man of considerable charisma. The conflict that led to his death began as a family dispute. A dispute over land and marriage that escalated, through a series of violent confrontations, into open rebellion. By 939, Masakado had conquered much of eastern Japan and declared himself the new emperor, a direct challenge to the authority of the court in Kyoto. The court sent armies. In 940, Masakado was killed in battle. His head was taken to Kyoto, a standard practice of the era, proof of the rebels' defeat. It was put on display in the capital. And then something happened that was recorded by multiple sources. The head did not decay. Days passed. The head remained fresh. And then, according to the accounts, it began to move. It opened its eyes. It called out. In some versions, it called for its body. In others, it spoke a curse. And then it flew. The head of Taira no Masakado is said to have lifted from its display post in Kyoto and flown east. All the way back to the Kanto region. All the way back to the land where Masakado had lived and fought and declared himself emperor. It came to rest in what is now the Otemachi district of Tokyo, where it remains. In a small stone mound, the Kubizuka, the head mound, surrounded by the skyscrapers of one of the most expensive real estate districts in the world. The headquarters of major Japanese banks and corporations sit within meters of it. The mound is maintained. It has fresh flowers. It has offerings. And it has a fence around it that nobody removes. I'm going to come back to this mound in detail. Because what has happened every time someone tried to interfere with it is the most remarkable part of this entire story. But first, the third spirit. The third of Japan's great vengeful spirits is the one that many scholars consider the most powerful. His name was Emperor Sutoku, and his story is the most heartbreaking. Sutoku was the 75th emperor of Japan, and his reign was defined by a conflict between himself and the court that he never fully controlled. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his younger brother. He remained in Kyoto for years as a retired emperor, powerful in theory, increasingly irrelevant in practice. The conflict erupted into open civil war in 1156, the Hogan Rebellion. Sutoku backed the losing side. He was captured. And for the first time in Japanese history, a member of the imperial family was sent into exile. He was sent to Sanuki province, on the island of Shikoku. In exile, Sutoku devoted himself to Buddhist practice. He spent years copying the sutras, thousands of pages of sacred texts, written in his own blood, as an act of extreme piety and devotion. He wanted these scriptures to be offered at temples on his behalf. He wanted to use his suffering to generate merit, spiritual currency, that might eventually lead to his release or redemption. He sent the completed scrolls to the court in Kyoto. They were refused. The court believed the scrolls were cursed, that a man of such concentrated bitterness could only produce something dangerous. When Sutoku received the news that his blood-written scriptures had been rejected, something broke. He is said to have bitten off his own tongue and used the blood to write a final curse on the cover of the returned scrolls. A curse on the imperial family. A curse on the court. A curse on Japan. He died in 1164 in exile. His fingernails and hair had grown wild. He had stopped eating. He looked, by the accounts of those who saw him at the end, less like a man than like something else entirely. After his death, the disasters began again. Political chaos. Wars. The Taira Minamoto conflict that consumed Japan for decades. Emperor after emperor died young. The capital burned. And the terror of Sutoku's spirit was so profound, even centuries later, that when Emperor Meiji restored imperial rule in the 19th century, one of his first acts was to build a shrine to Sutoku in Kyoto, to formally appease the man who had died cursing the imperial line. This happened in 1875. In the 19th century, in a country that was simultaneously building railways and adopting Western technology and writing a modern constitution, the shrine to appease a vengeful emperor who died 700 years earlier was not ironic. It was not a political gesture to traditionalists. It was, as far as the Meiji government was concerned, a necessary precaution. This is what I mean when I say Japan is the only country still governed by magic. Not magic in spite of modernity. Magic alongside it. Magic as a serious, functional part of how the country manages the forces that its tradition says are real. I want to tell you more about Sugawara no Mikizane, because his story has a dimension that most people outside Japan don't know. When Mikizane died in exile in 903, one of the things he left behind was his poetry. He had written poetry throughout his life, exquisite, technically precise poetry in the Chinese style that was the height of literary achievement in Heian period Japan. And in exile, facing his death, he continued to write. One of his most famous poems describes plum blossoms. He had a beloved plum tree in his garden in Kyoto, and when he was sent into exile, he left it behind. The poem is an expression of longing addressed to the tree, asking it to remember him, to carry his fragrance across the sea to where he had gone. According to legend, the tree did exactly that. It uprooted itself and flew through the air to be with Mikizane in Dazeifu. The flying plum tree. It is said to be the tree still growing in the garden of the Dazeifu Tenmangu shrine today, the shrine built over his grave, where his spirit is enshrined. I tell you this not because I expect you to believe in flying trees, but because the story tells you something about how the Japanese relationship with natural forces, with place, with the spirits of the dead, actually works at its deepest level. Mikizane loved a tree. The tree loved him back. The bond between a person and a place, between a spirit and the natural world, is so intimate that even after death it does not simply dissolve. It continues. It acts. This is the cosmology that underlies the 80,000 shrines. The understanding that the world is not made of inert matter plus human minds, but of relationships between people and places, between the living and the dead, between the present and the past. And the shrines are the infrastructure of those relationships. The maintenance of those bonds across time. When a corporate employee in Otemachi goes to make an offering at the Kubizuka before a major business decision, they are participating in a relationship that has been ongoing for over 1,000 years. A relationship between the living city and the dead warrior who claimed this land. That is not small. That is not trivial. That is, arguably, the deepest form of continuity that any human community can practice. When Tokugawa Ieyasu chose Edo as his capital in 1603, he understood something that most modern city planners have forgotten. A city is not just infrastructure. A city is a spiritual entity. And like any living thing, it has vulnerabilities. Points where darkness can enter. Directions from which disaster can approach. Japanese geomancy, the practice of reading the spiritual landscape and aligning human construction with it, identified the northeast as the most dangerous direction. The direction of demons. The Kaiman, the demon gate. In the Chinese cosmological system that influenced Japan, the northeast was where malevolent forces entered from, because it was the direction that faced neither the warming south nor the stable north, but the unstable, unprotected space between. Every traditional Japanese castle and city placed its most powerful spiritual protection at the northeast. Ieyasu placed Edo Castle at the center of his new capital. And at the northeast of Edo Castle, he built and positioned one of the most powerful shrines in Japan. Kanda Myojin. The shrine that would serve as the spiritual guardian of Edo from its most dangerous angle. But Ieyasu's design went further than a single protective shrine. He understood that one point of protection was not enough for a city of the scale he was planning. And so he, or the spiritual advisors who worked with him, designed a system. In Japanese cosmology, the Big Dipper, the seven-star constellation that has guided travelers and marked the north since humans first looked up, has particular significance. It is considered a source of protective cosmic power. And in the design of Edo, 7 shrines were placed at specific positions around the city, positions that, mapped from above, form the shape of the Big Dipper constellation. The 7 shrines of Edo's Big Dipper. Yoroi Shrine, Mizuinari Shrine, Tsukudo Hashiman Shrine, Kanda Myojin, Masakado's Kubizuka, Kabuto Shrine, Torigo Shrine. 7 points. 7 concentrations of spiritual power. Arranged in the shape of the greatest protective constellation in the sky, anchored to the ground of the new capital, forming a kekkai, a barrier that would protect Edo from spiritual intrusion. Now, Masakado's Kubizuka is in the list. The head mound of Taira no Masakado, the site where the head of the rebel emperor came to rest after flying from Kyoto, is one of the 7 points of the protective constellation surrounding Tokyo. This is not a coincidence. And it is not an oversight. Masakado's spirit was, from the beginning, one of the most powerful spiritual forces associated with the Kanto region, the region around Edo. The spirit of a man who had declared himself Emperor of the East. Who had died fighting the central government. Whose rage and power were considered so extreme that shrines were built to appease him. Ieyasu didn't try to destroy Masakado's power. He incorporated it. He placed the mound as one of the 7 stars in his protective constellation, turning the energy of the most powerful local spirit into part of the city's defense. This is the genius of the system. You do not fight the spirits. You do not pretend they don't exist. You acknowledge them. You honor them. You give them a place in the structure of the world, a role in the functioning of things, and in exchange, their power becomes yours. The 47 shrines that Tokugawa placed within the castle grounds. The temples positioned at the cardinal points of the city. The hundreds of neighborhood shrines that citizens maintained throughout Edo. All of it was part of a spiritual infrastructure as intentional and as functional, in the minds of those who built it, as the canals and roads. And this infrastructure has never been dismantled. Tokyo today, with its 14 million people, its subway lines, its glass towers, its technology companies, is built directly on top of Ieyasu's magic. The shrines are still there. The temples are still at their protective positions. The 7 stars of the Big Dipper are still in their places. Kanda Myojin still guards the northeast, the Demon Gate. And in Otamachi, surrounded by the headquarters of Mizuho Bank and NTT and multiple other major corporations, the Kubizuka still stands. The head of Taira no Masakado. Still in its place. Still doing its job. Which brings me to what I promised you at the beginning. What happens when someone tries to interfere with the magic? The placement of Kanda Myojin at the northeast corner of Edo Castle requires a little more explanation, because the northeast direction in Japanese cosmology is not just traditionally dangerous, it is specifically the direction from which the worst things come. The Kaiman. The Demon Gate. In the Chinese cosmological system that Japan adopted, the northeast is associated with the element of earth in transition, with the movement between yin and yang, with instability. The ox and tiger hours of the Chinese zodiac correspond to the northeast direction. The demon world, the realm from which oni and malevolent spirits approach the human world, is located in the northeast. Every traditional Japanese building of importance was designed to block the northeast. You put something powerful there. Something that can stop what comes from that direction. For Edo Castle, the most powerful available spiritual defense for the northeast was Kanda Myojin, the shrine that enshrines, among other spirits, Taira no Masakado himself. The rebel warrior. The man who flew east when he died. Who claimed the Kanto region as his own. Whose spirit was both feared and respected across the area. Ieyasu was essentially saying, if anything comes from the northeast, it will have to get through you first. And Masakado, enshrined at Kanda Myojin, facing the Demon Gate, this is now his role. Not enemy of the state. Protector of the city. Defender of the gate he died defending in a different way. The Japanese capacity to transform the nature of a powerful force, to redirect rather than eliminate, to honor rather than destroy, is perhaps the most sophisticated element of this entire system. The three great vengeful spirits are now three of Japan's most important protective deities. Mikizane is the god of learning. Every student in Japan prays to the man who died in exile, his loyalty repaid with banishment. Masakado is a patron of Tokyo itself. The rebel emperor who declared himself ruler of the East is now the spirit guarding the East. Sutoku, the most feared of the three, has his shrine in Kyoto, maintained by the imperial household, the family he cursed with his dying breath. All three were monsters to the people who wronged them. All three became gods to the people who chose to honor them. This is the magic. This specific alchemy, of grief into power, of enemy into guardian, is what Japan has practiced for over a millennium. And it still works. The Big Dipper pattern deserves one more moment of attention. The choice of the Big Dipper as the protective constellation for Edo was not arbitrary. In Chinese and Japanese astronomical tradition, the Big Dipper, called the Northern Dipper, Hokuto, the 7 stars of the bear, is the constellation most closely associated with time and governance. The handle of the dipper points in different directions throughout the year, essentially serving as a celestial clock. In Chinese imperial cosmology, the emperor was the pole star at the center of the turning sky, and the northern dipper was the instrument of his governance. For Tokugawa Ieyasu to pattern his city's spiritual defenses on the northern dipper was to claim the cosmological authority of the emperor for his shogunate. To say, this city is the center around which the stars turn. This city is aligned with the governing principle of heaven. The 7 shrines are not just a barrier. They are a declaration. And they are still there. Still in their positions. Still forming the pattern in the ground of Tokyo that mirrors the pattern in the sky. When the modern city was built over Edo, the planners, some of them, at least, knew what they were building on. And they built around it rather than through it. The shrine survived the rebuilding of Tokyo after the 1923 earthquake. They survived the firebombing of 1945. They survived 50 years of the most intense urban development in human history. The pattern holds. Look at a map of Tokyo's major shrines tonight. Put it next to an image of the Big Dipper. And see what you see. The Kubizuka sits in Otemachi, Tokyo. Otemachi is not a neighborhood that suggests ancient magic. It is one of the most intensely developed business districts in Japan, dense with financial institutions, corporate headquarters, government offices. The land values are among the highest in the country. In Otemachi, every square meter of ground is worth a significant sum of money. And in the middle of it, there is a small mound. A few stones. A fence. Some offerings, flowers, water, incense. A small wooden board identifying it as the grave of Taira no Masakado. It takes up space that, by any purely economic calculation, should be a parking structure or a lobby extension. It has been there for over 1,000 years. And the reason it is still there, the reason it has never been permanently removed despite multiple attempts and the extraordinary pressure of Tokyo's real estate market, is a series of events that are documented in historical records and in the institutional memory of every major organization that has ever shared a building with it. Let me tell you the history. In the 1920s, the Great Kanto earthquake devastated Tokyo. In the reconstruction that followed, the Kubizuka was disturbed. The records from that period are not entirely clear on the specifics, but in the reconstruction projects around Otemachi, the mound was disrupted. In the years that followed, a series of officials and workers who had been involved in the disturbance died in accidents or sudden illness. The connection was made. The mound was restored and reconsecrated. Then came the Second World War, and the American occupation of Japan. In 1945, American military forces occupying Tokyo decided to use the area around Otemachi for administrative purposes. The Kubizuka was in the way of planned construction. The decision was made to remove it. The removal began. Shortly after work started, a series of accidents occurred. Equipment malfunctioned. Workers were injured. And then, most significantly, the American officer in charge of the project died suddenly. The project was halted. The Kubizuka was not moved. The Japanese workers who had been involved in the removal attempt had warned their American supervisors. They had explained the history. They had said, specifically, this mound has killed people before. It will kill people again if you disturb it. The Americans, operating within a very different framework of belief about what forces in the world were real and dangerous, had proceeded anyway. After the officer's death, they reconsidered. The mound was reconsecrated. A ceremony was held. And the construction plans were rerouted around it. In the following decades, as Otemachi developed into one of Japan's premier business districts, the buildings grew taller and larger around the Kubizuka. But the mound itself was never again seriously challenged. The corporations whose buildings overlook it maintain it. They send representatives to ceremonies. They make offerings. They do this not as a quaint tradition but as a practical matter, because the institutional knowledge of what happened to the people who did not maintain the mound is part of the corporate memory of those organizations. This is still happening. Today. In one of the most economically rational, technologically sophisticated business districts in the world, major financial institutions make sure the flowers at a 1,000-year-old spiritual grave are fresh. Because the alternative, based on documented historical experience, is worse. I want to be clear about what I'm describing. I am not telling you that the ghost of Taira no Masakado is definitely real. I am not telling you that the deaths following the disturbance of the Kubizuka were definitely caused by supernatural forces. These are questions about the nature of reality that I cannot answer for you. What I am telling you is that the Japanese response to these events, the documented, consistent, continuing response across 1,000 years, has been to treat the mound as sacred and to leave it alone. And that this response has been made not only by medieval farmers operating within a pre-scientific worldview, but by modern governments, by American military administrators, and by contemporary corporations that employ thousands of people with advanced degrees. All of them, when confronted with the history of the Kubizuka, made the same decision. Don't touch it. And I think that tells us something interesting about the relationship between belief and evidence. We tend to think of magic and science as opposed. Magic is what people believed before science explained things. Science is what replaced magic. But Japan's approach to the Kubizuka is not based on belief instead of evidence. It is based on evidence. The evidence that something has happened, repeatedly, to people who disturbed this site. The evidence is imperfect, it could be coincidence, it could be confirmation bias, it could be a dozen other explanations. But it is, in the most basic sense, empirical. Observations accumulated over time, leading to a consistent behavioral response. Leave the mound alone. This is, I think, the deepest reason why Japan is the only country still using magic. Not because Japan is less rational than other countries. Japan is extraordinarily rational. It is one of the most precise, systematic, detail-oriented societies on Earth. But because Japanese culture has maintained a particular kind of epistemic humility. The humility to say, we do not fully understand what forces exist in the world. We have seen, over a very long time, that certain sites and certain spirits behave in ways we cannot explain. And rather than dismissing the observations, we choose to take them seriously. The 70,000 shrines across Japan are, among other things, a record of those observations. Each shrine marks a place where something was noticed. A place where the ordinary rules seem to bend. A place where someone decided, we should pay attention here. And that network of attention, that vast distributed system of careful acknowledgement, is the kekkai. The barrier. Not a wall. Not a weapon. But sustained, continuous, generational attention to the forces that most countries have decided to ignore. When you walk through Tokyo, you are walking through a city that has been paying attention for 400 years. Every shrine you pass is a node in that network. Every offering, every ceremony, every carefully maintained mound in the middle of a business district, is a continuation of something that Tokugawa Ieyasu understood in 1603 and that the corporations of Otomachi understand today. The magic is real. Not because spirits definitely exist in the way that tradition describes them, but because the practice of attention, the practice of acknowledging what we don't fully understand, of maintaining the spaces that seem to matter, of treating history with enough respect to not casually disrupt what has endured, is itself a form of wisdom. And Japan, alone among the nations of the modern world, has not yet decided that it knows better. Sleep well. And if you ever find yourself in Otomachi, take a moment. Stand near the Kubizuka. And see what you feel. Because there are things in that city that are older than the city, and older than the country, and older than the framework of explanation you arrived with. And some of them are paying attention. There is one final thing I want you to understand about the Kubizuka. It is not just a historical site. It is not just a tourist curiosity. It is a living part of the spiritual infrastructure of a working city. The corporations whose buildings overlook it send representatives twice a year to a formal ceremony of maintenance and respect. The ceremony is performed by a Shinto priest. The offerings are renewed. The space around the mound is cleaned. This is budgeted. It appears in the corporate calendar. Someone is assigned the responsibility of making sure it happens. And if you ask the executives of these corporations, people with MBAs, with experience in international finance, with every credential of modern rational management, why they do this, the answers are consistent. Because we have seen what happens when it is not done. Not 1,000 years ago. In living institutional memory. The history of what happened when the Kubizuka was disturbed during the American occupation, when the project manager died and the project was abandoned, that history is kept. It is part of the knowledge that organizations in Otomachi pass to new leadership. This is evidence-based behavior. The evidence is unusual, and the mechanism by which it operates is not understood. But the behavioral response, maintain the mound, perform the ceremonies, do not disturb what has endured here, is completely rational given the observed data. Japan has a word for this kind of accumulated, transmitted, practical wisdom. Chi. Wisdom, in the deepest sense, not just knowing facts, but knowing what to do with them. How to live in relationship with what you don't fully understand. The Kubizuka is Chi. 80,000 shrines is Chi. The kekkai of Edo is Chi. The last country governed by magic is, in this sense, the country that has maintained the longest and most careful relationship with what it does not know. And in a world where the things we do not know vastly outnumber the things we do, in a world where the consequences of dismissing what we don't understand are becoming increasingly visible, there may be something worth learning from the country that decided to maintain the mound. Just in case. Sleep well. And remember, somewhere in one of the most expensive business districts in the world, there are fresh flowers on an ancient grave tonight. Put there by someone who knows the history. And decided to pay attention.